Hello, folks. My name is Bo Brockett. I'm the communications coordinator for the Michigan Environmental Council. You're watching the Capital Connection webinar series, where we connect you to the big goings-on across Michigan in the environmental world. I'm filling in for Conan Smith, our president and CEO, who's the usual host of this series. Some of my favorite stories that I get to tell at MEC are those where we take these big, tough issues to kind of picture, to kind of visualize, and use like a local story to tell that story. And I'm really excited today to be able to do that with dunes and plovers. Joining me today is Megan Tinsley, the Water Policy Director at the Michigan Environmental Council, and Vince Cavalieri, a wildlife biologist at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which is part of the National Park Service. Vince, Megan, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, today's discussion is going to be about an iconic bird and an iconic ecosystem that are both in Michigan. But I want to first get started just by asking you both how you both came into this space around birds and around dunes. Would you maybe mind sharing a little bit of your history and then kind of how you came into the jobs that you have now? Vince, how about you start with you?
Okay. Sure. I was one of those wildlife dinosaur kids who was super into the outdoors even when I was very young. And I was lucky enough to have a grandfather who was a professional forester. So he was very into natural resources and kind of knew that world a little bit. So I knew I wanted to be in this field from a pretty young age. I got into birding super young, 7, 8 years old. I was already birding. And I actually started volunteering for breeding bird surveys when I was in high school. And I was lucky enough to kind of luck into a position surveying birds for a PhD student at Michigan Tech, even in summers when I was in high school. So I got put onto the path of a wildlife biologist and kind of professional birder type guy pretty young, and been here ever since.
Very cool. I love it. And Megan, what about you?
So for me, it's a little similar. I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors, loving it. I was studying biology in college, which is when I took a field ornithology class, which was it was a crash course, spring break long trip where we went to South Carolina and explored as many habitats and saw as many birds as possible. And from that point on, I've been a birder. But following undergrad, I did an internship where I was in part doing wading bird surveys, some biological study work. And it was there that I was really introduced to the field of environmental policy from the degradation I was seeing there in the coastal estuaries of Florida, plagued by algae blooms that were caused by freshwater releases, laden with nutrients. And I ended up studying policy in grad school, but I've been, I guess, fortunate enough, and probably not by coincidence, at every position I've had since grad school, also intertwining birds into policy work.
That's great. And I think both of you are getting to a point that hopefully this webinar will really get across, in that when you look at both of your job descriptions, dunes, water, it may not seem like birds naturally fit in there, but given Michigan's landscape, its place in the world, like dunes and water are really intertwined with our bird populations that come and go through here. And I think like the piping plover, which we're here to talk about today, is a great example of that. Vince, would you maybe mind giving us a little bit of a rundown of what the piping plover is and why it's so iconic to Michigan and to the dune systems?
Certainly. I'm going to try to share my screen so I can run through this. Let's see. Hopefully it works. Everyone seeing that okay?
Good from my side. Yep.
All right. So piping plover. Piping plover is a species that's listed on the federal endangered species list. There are actually 3 different populations that are each managed as separate, distinct population segments under the Endangered Species Act. And that's just a Fish and Wildlife Service designation under the act that almost essentially treats them as 3 separate species, even though they're not officially separate species. Here on the map, this is an illustration from National Audubon Society. It kind of shows the 3 populations, where they breed and where they winter. So you have both the Atlantic coast population that breeds along the eastern seaboard, kind of from southern Maine to northern North Carolina. And that subspecies of plover breeds only on beaches of the Atlantic Ocean and migrate mostly to Florida and the Caribbean, especially in the Bahamas. You have the Great Plains population, which is out on mostly on sandbars in big rivers like the Missouri River, Platte River, things like that. And they mostly winter in Texas, Louisiana, and northern Mexico. But of course, today we want to talk about our favorite, the Great Lakes piping plover, which is the only one that's federally endangered. The other two are federally threatened. It's a much rarer population. Today I got about 75 pairs, and they winter, they breed only on wide sandy beaches of the Great Lakes associated with dune systems. And they're mostly here in northern Michigan, but have since spread out again to all 5 of the Great Lakes. One time they had been extirpated from all but northern Michigan. And they mostly winter in coastal South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So let me see, make sure this works. So I mentioned how they only breed on wide sandy beaches and dunes in the Great Lakes. This was a postage stamp issued by Postal Service not too long ago. And I think it's just a great illustration of something I'd like to talk about, which is that the Great Lakes piping plover is an umbrella species for the coastal dune, Great Lakes dune ecosystem. And what I mean by that is the protections that we provide to piping plover because of its designation as a federally endangered species help protect all of this very fragile and important ecosystem that is Great Lakes dunes. Here in this photo, you can see this flower here is a pitcher's thistle, which is a federally threatened species of plant that's only found in dune systems of the Great Lakes. It's a totally endemic here. And then there's a number of other sensitive species, including some other birds, like there's a Vesper sparrow on here, a spotted sandpiper, some gulls, different things, different other endemic plant species like hairy puccoon and some other things that are found only in Great Lakes systems. So the piping plover, while just a very rare small bird, really has an outsized importance in protecting the rare Great Lakes ecosystem. This is just some pictures of plovers. These are plovers in breeding plumage. The one behind me is a piping plover photo I took in Louisiana of a bird in wintering plumage. They lose that black forehead band and neck band in the winter time. They're quite small. They're about halfway between the size of a chickadee and a robin. So it's a very small shorebird. You can see they're kind of got this dapper orange and black bicolored bill, and then the black forehead band, neck band, black stripe on the tail. But otherwise, they're very pale, and they blend in very well with the sand of the Great Lakes beaches. Just some more photos. These are adult plover photos I've taken here at Sleeping Bear Dunes. I think these ones were all out on North Manitou Island, which is our largest breeding colony in the Great Lakes. Here's a plover on its nest. And that's what the nests look like. So they nest right out on the beach, and which is one of the reasons why they became endangered. The nest is kind of out unprotected on the beach, but they blend in very well. They really use camouflage. You can see they just dig out a little hole in the sand, a little scrape we call it, and lay their 4 eggs inside the cup. And then they typically decorate the nest with small pebbles and shells. And if you're not looking closely, they just look like rocks. And I think historically people would have stepped on them or really crowded out the plovers before we started protecting their nesting areas. And everyone always appreciates piping plover chicks. They're one of those really cute little puffball birds. They're precocial, which means they are ready to, run on the beach as soon as they're hatched. So they, they hatch within 2 or 3 hours. They're up, running around, following mom and dad on the beach, and they can feed themselves almost immediately. However, they're very reliant on the parents for warmth. They can't thermoregulate very well on their own for the first 10 days or so. So you'll often see photos of plover chicks hiding underneath the adults. And what that is the parents are actually brooding them. So they're kind of going over the chicks, like putting their feathers around them and keeping them warm. And then, of course, the adults also defend them from predators. Just a picture of piping plover habitat. This is also out on North Manitou Island. You can see the little plover there, and they're just out there on the dunes and beaches of the Great Lakes. I love this photo because we have a captive rearing program as part of this recovery effort. And what that is we take eggs into captivity that have been abandoned. So if for some reason one of the adults is killed by a predator, or the nest is abandoned because of human issues like a dog or something else, we will raise those eggs in captivity. This is an effort that's headlined by the Detroit Zoo, and all the federal and state agencies work with them on that. And the chicks get hatched out, raised up until they fledge, and then we release them back into the wild. And I love this photo because the bird on the right is a captive released plover that was released no more than 5 minutes before this photo was taken. And the bird on the left is a wild reared chick that was just out there on the beach where we released it. And within 5 or 10 minutes, the captive chicks were blended right in with these wild ones. And that was kind of a nice moment last summer. We banned all of the plovers in the Great Lakes as part of a big research project, trying to learn more about them. This is just some action shots from us banning some of the plovers last year. This is me, my crew, and the one handing me the plover here is Alice Van Zorn, who is one of our longest term people in the program, has been banding and working on plovers for a long time. It's just us working on the plover, collecting scientific info like Wade, and collecting some samples and things like that. And there's just our little plover. We do habitat restoration work as well. This is up at Wilderness State Park at the tip of the Mitt by Mackinac Bridge. And this was a place that had kind of been overrun by invasive plants and some other things. Continuous low water levels in the 90s and 2000s had led to some plant encroachment. So this is a place DNR and other groups worked on plover habitat restoration and actually created this nice nesting beach where we do have nesting plovers now. And I just love this artwork by a local Leelanau County artist who put some iconic Leelanau County imagery inside of a plover. And I just wanted to include it to show how kind of important plovers are to folks in this area.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a great closer to your description of plovers too, because I think it tees us up really well for some other discussions to have, right? Like you mentioned, plovers are very emblematic of dunes, but and also of the area that you're at, of the Leelanau area. And that took me back to your previous slide of the postage stamp showing how the plover is really an umbrella species of dunes. It seems like, I think you mentioned that dune systems are globally rare, and Michigan just so happens to have, I think, the largest freshwater dune system in the world. And that seems to make this bird and these dunes all the more important to our state. Is that a fair line of thought right there?
I think so, and Megan, feel free to chime in, but the Michigan's dunes are the largest freshwater dune system in the entire world, and have all these endemic species and are very important globally.
Noted. And maybe that brings us into the other topic. You also mentioned that not only are you monitoring, banding plovers, but you also mentioned too that you're doing it for a reason, right? You mentioned that there's some issues with the dune systems themselves. And you also mentioned too that plovers are endangered. That happens for a reason. Would you maybe mind going into some of the threats that plovers and then maybe dunes at large are facing?
Sure. So I think the story of the plover kind of reflects the story of the dune systems across the Great Lakes in general. Historically, so we're talking 1800s, there were perhaps as many as 800 pairs of piping plovers across the Great Lakes. That number is always kind of somewhere between 500 and 800. And they were found at anywhere in the Great Lakes where you had wide sandy beaches and dune systems. By the 1980s, there were 17 pairs left of Great Lakes piping plovers total. And they had gone from the entirety of the Great Lakes to a handful of sites in northern Michigan. That's it in the entire world. What had happened is a mix of things. The biggest of them was habitat loss. So the dunes were, exploited for a variety of reasons. You had, especially in the southern part of the lakes, you had a lot of industrial development. You lost your shorelines near Chicago and Milwaukee and Cleveland and Toronto and all these other places to that. But then you also saw a proliferation of second homes, vacation properties, other development in the dunes, even in northern Michigan and northern parts of the lakes as well. And you also saw an increase in recreation pressure. Everyone loves to go to places like Sleeping Bear Dunes and other places with beautiful dune systems. And the problems kind of the dunes get loved to death. So if you have sometimes when I show slideshows like that, I have a picture showing a piping plover nesting spot before it was protected that has literally hundreds of people out recreating, and which is fine. But if the plovers aren't protected, they're not going to be able to use a site that's getting such heavy use. There's some other things that happened, increase in predator numbers, for example. But that habitat loss mixed with recreation pressure, which includes things like dogs off leash, ATVs in the dunes, ORVs, even something as simple as flying a kite can disturb plovers. So it's kind of a mix of human pressures, the same thing that's caused us to lose or have degraded dunes throughout the Great Lakes.
Yeah, that's great. And we had a question from in the chat come in asking about how adversely impacted plovers are with Great Lakes water level changes. Do you see that playing a role, or maybe that playing a role in the future as climate change gets worse and may impact lake levels?
Definitely, it definitely plays a factor, and maybe in some surprising ways. And both levels that are too high or too low are actually can be a problem, or if they're not changing. So the beach system is dynamic, right? The dunes have like natural succession, and the plovers are really adapted to an early part of the dune succession. They like a very low level of plant growth in the dunes. They like less than 30% plant cover. So eventually, if a dune is stabilized, it starts to get more and more plants growing on it. And eventually, even native plants, if you start getting trees, plovers really don't like woody plants. If you start getting trees, the plovers leave the area. So what happened when we had an extended period of low water is the plants really just took over the dunes, and the plovers leave the area when that happens. Now, high water, is also a problem. So what happens in those low periods is the dunes start to stabilize, they become harder, and then when the water goes up, you start to have water right up to those plants. Here's a great example. Yeah, so here's Oval Beach. So like say this stays, like the plants on the right here, this is just mostly dune grass. And it comes down all the way to almost the water because it's stabilized. And then the water comes up and all of a sudden you don't have a beach. It's just plants right down to the water line. And the plovers won't use that anymore. So if you have a healthy interplay between high and low levels, like in what we would have thought of as the normal water cycle of the Great Lakes, you'll always have certain areas that have nice beaches for the plovers. But if we start seeing like continuous high water there because of climate change or something like that, that could definitely play a role. We'd see less habitat, and the plovers would have a tough time.
Noted. And I think this,
I
I'm
think,
sorry, Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you stated this well, that by developing, so many of the dunes, we're kind of locking into place sort of where the features are. And as Vince said, these are dynamic systems. They're supposed to move and shape and be driven. In fact, the threatened and endangered species we find there are dependent upon that wind action with the sand and the way that it shapes the dunes. And so by having so much development along the coastal areas, we're kind of prohibiting the natural processes from taking place.
That's a great point. And that kind of brings up like this interesting dynamic that you both have alluded to. Let me see if I can move my slideshow here. So over the course of a few years, the Michigan Environmental Council worked with Michigan State University and a few other colleges to kind of map out the dunes in different ways. We did your classic like GIS mapping of the freshwater dunes. You saw those repeat photography photos where we took like an old photo and went to that same spot decades later to see how the dunes have changed. And then there was a final project where we kind of mapped out people's perceptions of dunes. And I think this kind of captures the tension that we're alluding to pretty well, where people really do value their dune systems here in Michigan. They love it for its beauty, for its natural wonders, for the species that it protects. But at the same time, there's also this recreational aspect where we want to enjoy them. And because we want to enjoy them and get on them, development is more likely to happen around or in those dune systems. And so by enjoying it, we're also putting it a little bit at risk of it too. And Megan, I know this is where you kind of come in, right? We at the Michigan Environmental Council are thinking of ways that we can protect our dune systems in ways that are benefiting nature first and foremost, but are also still giving people access to the things that they love. Could you talk a little bit about how we can maybe start to solve this issue from like a statewide level or from like a more localized level?
Sure. So in 2012, there were some protections in place in the Critical Dunes Act that were rolled back. And so it made some development and other things taking place in the dunes easier to accomplish. So we lost some statewide protections in that front. And that's one place just for us to sort of get started, is to restore some of those protections, take a fresh look at that act, think how we could make it better for changing times, but also look at the dunes as a whole, because not all dunes in the state are classified as critical. So, but they're all important. And as we see the changes taking place from climate change, we'll, come to realize even more how important the protection that the dunes offer our human and built environment, how important that is. So we're also interested in making changes across the board to how we approach everything when it comes to the dunes. So looking at not putting development as close to the dunes, because again, they're dynamic. They need to change and shift with time. And we don't need to lock into place where the dune features are right now. And also moving away from things that we see in many developed areas like coastal armoring. So those hardening of the shorelines where people are worried about losing their beach. So going in and putting hard features like seawalls or a bunch of rocks piled up, all that does is interfere with the natural replenishment process of the waves bringing the sand to the shore that will create areas eventually for plovers to nest as they lose some areas, overtaken by plants. We need new areas replenished with sand to give them the features that they need to survive. So we need to move away from just armoring our developed areas by seawalls and things like that, and just work with the shore in a way that's not counterproductive to what we will expect to see with climate change.
Noted. And I take it too that I'm sure we had that not enough time has passed from when portions of the Critical Dunes Act were repealed to like know its true effects. But my understanding is the Critical Dunes Act really protected the dunes from like obscene development, whether that be industrial or more commercial development. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so we just need to restore the protections, again, take a fresh look at where we could make them better and look at other uses of the dunes that we might not think of as development, but things like sand mining.
Noted. And Vince, I know that you, as a person on the ground, you're probably seeing some things too, some easy steps that, or maybe more difficult steps that need to be taken to help preserve the dunes and the plovers, like breeding grounds. Have you noticed anything in particular that might help?
Well, I think that armoring piece was really huge. The recovery goal for piping plovers is 150 breeding pairs. Right now we're in like around 75. So we still need to, we're only about halfway there. I think armoring, and this is true both in the Great Lakes and on the plovers wintering grounds down in Georgia and South Carolina, different places. The more we armor, the less you're going to see the dynamic processes of water and dune interplay. And that's really going to cause the loss of the ability to see new habitat develop. And, if we want to get to 150 pairs, we need enough habitat to get there. And I fear things like development and armoring and in places not currently protected could be a hindrance in that in the long run. Gotcha.
The Environmental Council has set forth like 7 big goals for the next 2 years that we want to see accomplished, in the legislature or through like the different departments of Michigan. And protecting the critical dunes of Michigan, or I should say all dunes in Michigan, is one of those 7 priorities. That's going to take some time. In the meantime, like Megan and Vince, if there's things that people, do you have any recommendations for things that people can do to help out, whether that be really hands-on or a little bit more stepped back?
I can kind of do the hands-on one on the ground. For plovers, if you come to a place like Sleeping Bear Dunes or Wilderness State Park or some of these other protected areas where the plovers currently live, following the rules that are stated on signage, like closed areas, keeping your dog either away or on leash if you're in an area signed for those things, pick up trash after yourself so you're not leaving waste that's going to attract predators to the plover areas. If you see a plover, be cognizant that they are sensitive species, and you don't want to. I've showed some nice photos, but those were all taken with telephoto lenses from long distance, or where I was sitting very still and the plovers approached closer to me. If you're chasing after them, taking pictures and disturbing them, that's not a good thing. So just the typical kind of be a good steward of the land, follow the rules, be sensitive to other species, that kind of thing.
Great.
And for the policy piece, I would just say one reason I really love these webinars is that we're able to capture those that tuned in. So we have contact information for everyone that registered. And, we're obviously working on a lot at the Michigan Environmental Council. But when we, start ramping up this dunes work and we actually have bills that are, going to be heard in committee, it's great to have a contingent of folks that are willing to weigh in at the right opportunities. So we can hopefully get some of these more protective measures passed.
That's a great point. And just so folks who are watching live know, we'll be sending out like a follow-up email that'll not only have a recording of this webinar, but also have some resources for you, both educational and more action-oriented, that you can take and keep in mind. And to Megan's point, keep in touch. We'll be launching kind of a larger scale effort pretty soon, and we could really, people's thoughts and feedback to their legislators really do matter. And that'll be a great opportunity too. Well, I know that we're just past the hour here, so unfortunately we have to round up the conversation, but I just want to thank you both, Megan and Vince, again for taking some time out of your days to join us and talk about this.
Yeah, thanks, Bo.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you too to everyone that tuned in. We always appreciate you all stopping by during your lunch hours, your lunch breaks, to learn a little bit more about the goings on in Michigan. And also want to thank our sponsor for the webinar series, CalSec, which is a Kalamazoo-based global organization that works on food ingredients. And it's pretty unique in that it's a B corporation, meaning that it is held to the highest standards of social and environmental progress. So thank you to CalSec for sponsoring this series as well. All right, with that, I believe we can all log out. Thank you all so much for stopping by today, and we'll see you next time on Capital Connection.